All right, so let's jump into
Okay.
this painful paradox of needing food, but then blaming yourself for needing it, right? And eating it. So I guess we want to start with why do we even need to be talking about this? Why is this important, and what are we talking about? So,
Yeah. Well, I think the first thing we're doing is we're normalizing,
yep.
right? I mean, everybody is in this community because somewhere along the lines they found that food actually fulfilled an emotional need. Okay. Not because you love food too much, not because you don't have control, but because there was a deficiency in being able to take care of yourself and take care of your emotional world in a way that was healthy. And you stumbled upon food, and guess what? Food really worked.
Yeah.
And we all need to feel comforted and in control. And we all need to kind of distract ourselves from things that are overwhelming from time to time. And if we were never presented with anything else that was healthy for us to kind of get through life, we're going to use food.
That's right.
You
Yeah.
know?
And we need it when we
Yeah.
don't learn other strategies. So we do need something to calm us down. But I think, what's so important about why we have to talk about this is because if we don't identify why at one point in life you needed food, not wanted food,
Right.
but needed it for your true emotional and psychological survival. If we don't talk about that and if we don't connect those dots, what happens is you're left with this assumption as an adult that something is wrong with you and that you must just need to try harder because then you'll get it. And that's where I think people fall prey to these darn diets,
Yeah.
right? Because
Yeah.
diets lead people to believe that if they would just try harder,
Mhm.
they would get the promised result when really is you guys probably know, diets set you up to fail really from the beginning. So we have to talk about this paradox of needing food and where that need comes from, which we're going to get to in a minute, and then blaming yourself afterwards for needing it. And we're going to talk about where that comes from too.
Yeah.
Because if we don't connect those dots, then diets come in and convince you that that's the answer.
Yeah. I'm wondering how many people have heard phrases like, you just need to.
Right.
Okay. And if you wanted this bad enough,
Mhm.
right? Or if you said to yourself, on Monday, I'm going to start to do this behavior different.
Right.
Okay. Let us know if you've said some of those things to yourself, if you've heard family members, loved ones, and probably very well intended.
Mhm.
But what that ends up doing is it ends up creating an experience of shame.
Right.
You know, like, what is wrong with myself? Okay. That I can't get on top of this. And so then you keep trying over and over and over again
Right.
mechanisms that really aren't about your need for food.
Right.
Right? A diet or a diet plan or more structure has absolutely nothing to do with what is emotionally driving you to need food.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, one of the things we say a lot in the program here is emotional eating is not an eating problem.
Right.
It's an emotional solution. And it's a solution that you learned.
Yeah.
So why don't we jump into kind of where this comes from? And I think one thing we'd like to add before we jump into that is you're going to hear us repeating some of the same concepts or same phrases throughout these video casts. And at first we're like, oh, maybe we're being too repetitive or redundant, but really this is quite intentional because we do believe that while there may be a little bit of redundancy, it's so important that you hear this message about how to respond to and nurture your emotional self, because that really is the crux of this deeper work. And it's what so many of other programs, especially diets or anything kind of food related like that, really misses the mark on. And so at the risk of sounding a bit redundant at times, we want to make sure that you keep getting this message in lots of different angles.
Yeah. And I'm going to add to that because I think the more you hear this message from us, the more you're going to start internalizing that. And then if you find yourself reaching for food when you recognize that you're not physically hungry, you're going to go through this structure within yourself. Okay.
Exactly.
So what's going on? What created it? And what do I need to do different?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it becomes kind of that internalized voice that we talked a little bit about in the last video cast.
Yeah, I was going to say, just like last week where we talked about mirroring, right?
Exactly.
That we mirrored when we were young, but we also mirror as adults.
So we want to do that for you.
Yeah,
Okay. What's the behavior? What created it? Okay. Having some self-acceptance, some compassion, and then identifying the need and then stepping in and doing it differently.
Yeah.
Right?
Doing it lovingly.
Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. So where does this come from?
Well, I think it starts with the fact that we all need to be responded to with our emotions and our needs throughout our life. And that goes from our physical needs all the way up to our emotional needs. And in an ideal situation, okay, when there is a sense of physical or emotional distress, we have an attuned, safe, attachment figure, right? Your caregiver that then reads your signals, responds readily, and consistently meets that need.
That's right.
Okay. And then your system calms down. Right. And you feel safe and you feel secure and you feel like everything is good because I put out a signal. I'm in distress. The world responds to me and I feel better.
And in those situations, then food is just food, right? It's nutritional sustenance. So when you're hungry, you want food. But outside of hunger, if you're scared, if you're cold, if you're upset, if you're needing anything else, you trust that your caregiver will respond to those needs appropriately. So food is just food.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and just kind of looking at that example, there is a reason why so many people struggle with food as a way to deal with their emotions, and that is because food very, very early in life was a response both to that physical need of hunger, and then it goes into that emotional area. Okay, so if you think about an infant, like very, very primitive, and you are having an experience of hunger, which just kind of feels like this feeling of distress within your whole being, you cry and then you receive that warm milk, okay, which has carbohydrates and sugar. It releases chemicals within your system. It literally calms you down, relaxes you, and most of the time brings you to sleep, right? So in that very early kind of repeated cycle, really for like the first 6-9 months of your life, right? It's like I feel distress, I'm being fed, it's warm, nurturing, there's chemicals, I feel relaxed, okay? So that's both physical need and then it gets connected to emotional need. And there's this physiological reaction. That same physiological reaction happens with ice cream, or happens with, bread or other carbohydrate rich foods that then you reach for and it calms your system down, right? Relaxes you. And that cycle gets really reinforced. And it works.
Yeah, so anytime you eat sugar, salt, and fat, which is primarily what you get when you eat carbohydrates, is going to release dopamine, which is our feel-good neurotransmitter, and serotonin, which is going to balance out our mood. Yeah, and actually, I didn't know this up until recently, but the only way that our brain produces more serotonin is by eating starchy carbohydrates.
That was complete news to me.
So I mean, that really reinforces like why the cereal and the brownies and the chips and the tortillas and all of those things really do call your name. When you're in emotional distress and you have that paired up with food will help calm me down. I mean, you guys aren't craving steaks and carrots and things like that. You tend to crave starchy carbs.
So then this becomes the question. So if this is natural and normal for everybody, right? Why doesn't everybody
struggle?
Right, exactly. So why aren't we
We didn't plan that.
all, no, why aren't we all,
Right.
emotional and binge eaters?
Yeah.
Okay. So that's a great question.
Yeah, so it gets compounded then by this caregiver interaction,
Yeah.
right? Where you have, as you grow up, you have all of these more complicated, complex emotional needs as a child,
Yes.
as an adolescent, and there aren't other avenues by which these emotions are being responded to
Yes.
and addressed.
Yeah.
So, food might be one of those very primitive ways in which we are responded to. But if that becomes one of the only ways as we continue to develop, that's where things tend to become very problematic. And as children grow up, what they need are caregivers and adults who are able to respond in other ways too. Like, hey, let's sit down and talk about this. Or let me stroke your arm while you cry. Let me just hold you. Let me offer some reassurance. Yeah.
Yeah.
There's lots of other ways. And so then food, everybody emotionally eats here and there, but food doesn't become then kind of the primary or only way for emotional comfort.
Yeah, exactly. So as people grow up and their needs are more complex, right? There becomes more tools in the toolbox, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
To help you to self-soothe. And in an ideal situation, you have at least one, but hopefully more caregivers, parents
Yeah.
and babysitters and
Coaches,
grandparents,
teachers.
exactly,
Yeah.
that respond to you in different ways, and then you internalize that, and then you start doing that for yourself.
Right.
So you have this emotional toolbox that is well equipped to deal with many different struggles, challenges, emotions over time.
Exactly.
And food is just then one of them,
Right,
right? You
right.
have food, sometimes most of the time it tastes good, right? And sometimes it comforts you, but you also have hugs and you have intimate relationships with others, and you have ways to really give yourself a hug and to soothe yourself.
Sure.
Okay. So that's an ideal situation.
Yeah. And one thing that came to my mind as you were saying that is you're talking about, a child learning how to self-regulate. And what's also really important in these interactions is that the child is co-regulated with this adult. And what that requires is an adult to stay grounded, to stay emotionally regulated, while the child is very naturally and appropriately and organically dysregulated, right? So
explain those words.
yeah. So so I have a 7-year-old daughter. So so if you have a 7-year-old and she's, really upset about something that's important to her, sometimes she can get a little feisty with me, a lot feisty actually. And I can, very easily, if I wasn't staying grounded, I could get really worked up. Maybe she says something that's not very nice, or she starts misbehaving, and I could then start to get really agitated and upset with her. And then we kind of escalate until it's just a bad thing. So co-regulating means that I'm able to say, okay, she's 7, her brain has just gone offline. I need to help her. Something is going on with her. She's not being a brat just to be a brat. She's struggling. So I need to stay calm and grounded and go be with her and teach her how to walk through whatever's going on for her. And when I stay grounded and regulated, what she experiences then, remember she's mirroring, is, okay, this emotion is uncomfortable, and I can get through it. It's not the end of the world. It's not going to take over. Bad things aren't going to happen. It's just uncomfortable, but I can use X, Y, and Z skills that mom is teaching me and doing with me. Because I think what we see so often in adults who struggle is there's this incredible fear that if I really allow this emotion to come up inside of me, it's going to be like a tsunami and it's just going to take over, right?
So what we're going to go back to is some of those scenarios that we talked about both in the first our VideoCast and the second VideoCast, because what Dr. Ashley is saying is this great kind of pairing, right? And isn't Natalie just so fortunate to have you? She is. She doesn't know it yet right now, but she will when she's older. But oftentimes in the history of people who develop emotional and binge eating, that matching and that really capable, emotionally capable adult is not present.
Right.
Okay.
Exactly.
So
Thank you for saying that, because that was where I was trying to go and I didn't. So I'm glad you finished that.
That's okay. No, you were leading me into that, so that's all good.
Yes. I didn't know I was, but yes.
You are my left hand and I'm the right hand, so that's all
Perfect.
good. Okay, so this is what we do for each other. Okay, so if you don't have that, right, and especially if you have a household where there is some low-grade chaos going on, or maybe there's some disruption because maybe there's an alcoholic parent, or maybe there's a sibling that is bullying you, you know,
Or a
maybe
raging parent.
or a raging parent, and your system just, you know, is activated, and you don't have that attuned, present, consistent, well-regulated adult, right? Your system still has these needs. And think about the most primitive mechanism you learned very early on that something did work, right?
Exactly.
Because the very basic thing that you were given was food.
Exactly.
Okay. So your system, and I have like goosebumps as I'm saying this, okay, your system remembers. It has muscle memory. And so when there is no other solution, right, no other way to feel better, it automatically goes towards food. Okay. It is actually wired in a really early, both emotional and physiological way. And everybody needs to feel comforted and soothed. Okay. That's not weakness. That's to be human. Okay. So if in your history you didn't have a Dr. Ashley as your wonderful parent, okay, very likely your muscle memory said, oh my gosh, I've got that cake, right, on the kitchen counter. I'm tired, I'm stressed, I've got something I'm looking towards tomorrow at work and I'm really worried about it. Okay, boom, that chocolate cake is there, and then you start eating it.
Yeah, exactly. And it is so powerful.
Yeah, because then it's got not only great taste, but it's got sugar and carbohydrates, and your physiology responds and you feel better. So darn it, every single time it's reinforcing this cycle, right? And it's connecting to the past when it worked also, okay?
Exactly.
I was in distress, I was given food, I calmed down. Okay, so that's where that need, that compulsion, that drive comes in, and it overrides your brain. It overrides what you want. It overrides the diet that you started on Monday.
It overrides logic.
Yes.
Yeah. What you know you should do.
Right. Or even what you want to do.
Yeah.
Okay.
Exactly.
And then all too often you go in and you end up beating yourself up.
Yeah.
Okay. But do you want to add anything to that conceptualization?
Yeah, no, you said that brilliantly. I would, the one little piece that I share a lot with the clients that I work with is, you know, I really see food as a developmentally appropriate drug of choice.
I love that.
And I'm not saying that binge eating disorder is an addiction per se. There's a lot of debate about that. We won't get into.
We'll have to do a VideoCast on that because there's a lot.
Yeah, and I think that's really neither here or there, because really what the issue is you're this little kiddo with these big emotions. You don't have an adult to contain them and kind of guide you through them. It's super overwhelming. You've got, you know, most of the people that we work with will say, like, I kind of started using food around 5 or 6. It wasn't binge eating necessarily, but they have memories of, you know, maybe grabbing the bag of cookies and running into the bedroom and hiding out and eating. And so, I mean, if we look at it just from a developmental perspective, I think that it is kind of the appropriate drug of choice. You know, you don't have access to alcohol or drugs yet, but you do have access to food. And they've shown that carbohydrates and cocaine actually have very similar effects on the brain. So there's just a lot of biochemistry that's at hand that then decades of practice, if you will, and reinforcement then makes this such an automatic process.
Yeah. So you also then open the door to the next concept, and that is that there's this little kiddo and they're eating this food, and oftentimes in the family somewhere that starts getting noticed and targeted. Okay, you had talked about you start blaming yourself. Well, we also in our past video casts were talking about how you internalize those mirrored messages from those attachment figures, right?
Exactly.
So somewhere, because certainly nobody knows that it's wrong to overeat food when you're a kid, right? You're just doing it.
Yeah.
So somewhere along the lines, you then get this message, right? No, you can't have that.
Right.
Okay.
It's bad.
It's bad. You can only eat the healthy food. You can't eat that. Or what are you doing? You're doing this again, right? So somewhere there's these negative messages that then get internalized, associated with you eating. Okay. Yet there's that need. Okay. So
and the paradox begins.
The paradox begins. And we talk about neurons that fire together, wire together. So if you have this need for food because there's no other way to comfort yourself in your early life, it gets then coupled with some sort of a statement that feels critical to you, that highly sensitive little self. Okay. Then it gets wired together. Okay. I need food, but then I'm going to start blaming myself. Okay. Needing food, blaming self. And then it usually opens up the door to hiding or binging, because I'm going to eat it now. I'm going to eat it really fast, right? Usually in secrecy. Okay. And then it gives way to that self-ridicule, okay, that shame, that lack of self-worth that we talked about last week.
Yeah. It's just an awful process.
Yeah.
And it starts, oftentimes just at a very young time where you don't know any better or any different. But then it internalizes, like you said, you become an adult and you do start to learn better and know better, but those automatic emotional processes are just so entrenched and intense by then.
Yeah. Absolutely.
So that actually really, I think, starts to address this next piece in our format of, how this shows up in the here and now, right? So we look back, we see this little kiddo who had these big emotions, nobody to help with those emotions, as you're saying, needing something to help and having this muscle memory that food works, but then getting blamed, criticized, rejected, whatever, for using food in that way.
Can.
Yeah,
okay,
please.
because I think this, or being put on a diet.
Yeah.
Okay. So oftentimes, and you guys maybe post something if this fits, being placed on a diet at a really early age. We hear 6, 7, 8, 9. Okay.
Weight Watchers meetings at 11.
With mom, right?
Just gut-wrenching.
So again, there's this other message that says, something's wrong with this behavior. You can't have food, right? We need to put some restrictions on you. We all know that people can't continue with diets. 95% of people are going to go off the wagon and regain the weight. And then there's another layer of blaming.
Right, exactly.
Okay. So that then dieting mentality and that dieting culture becomes that other layer that adds to that self-blame.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And you just kind of get hit from all angles.
Yeah.
So then all of that gets internalized into kind of this adult experience of yourself where you feel big emotions. I mean, I don't know about you, but I feel big emotions, especially as a highly sensitive person. I mean, that is life. When you're plugged into life, you're feeling big emotions, right? But if your initial response is, uh-oh, big emotion, bad, I need to get away, then you've already kind of kicked off that whole process of big emotion, that's bad, I want to get away, food.
Yeah. Or big emotion, I'm overwhelmed.
Yeah.
Automatically, just boom, food.
Exactly.
Okay. Because again, it's neurologically wired together. Okay.
Yeah.
And all emotions are big. Like emotions are, they're just there, and that's not a bad thing. And if you had that appropriate caregiving, emotional caregiving when you're little, then you would get those mechanisms to help self-soothe. But not, it becomes overwhelming or bad or something to detach from, and you're wired to reach for food. Okay.
Yeah, and so that really is kind of that process you might see within yourself now as an adult of you feel something and within a nanosecond you're thinking about pizza,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Or you're thinking about which restaurant you're going to go to for dinner. It just becomes that emotional escape, and it offers a little bit of relief. But again, the painful paradox is it's very brief, and you're going to get hit with a ton of shame and blame, either during the relief. So some people will say, I feel relief and shame at the very same time. Or I get a little reprieve, maybe during the eating episode, but then the second it's over, it's like, boom, that shame is there just clobbering you.
Yeah, yeah. And one of the reasons why I really like this conversation, and I hope you guys do too, is because when you're talking about then, going to get pizza and it being so automatic, what we want you to be able to do is to not blame yourself and kind of do what Dr. Ashley was saying in her wonderful recovery hacks. Like, of course, okay, something big happened. Of course, my brain just got wired automatically to go towards food. But let me now look at what is kind of a new way that I can step in and respond to that emotion so that I don't have to go towards food. Kind of like starting to develop some of those new tools in my adult toolbox so that it's not so deficient as when you were a child. Okay. And then that's going to start getting fired together and wired together. Okay. So we're going to be rewiring that emotional neurobiology.
Right.
Okay.
That response
system in your adult self in the here and now.
Yeah. And part of the reason why we're going to be repeating some of these concepts over and over and over again is because we want this to become how you respond to yourself in a very automatic way. So when I feel something, okay, of course I feel that way. What am I needing right now? What would help me feel better? Something that's really fulfilling, not food. I mean, if you're hungry, by all means eat. But if it's something that's more emotional, maybe you're needing support from someone else, or maybe you're needing to do something for yourself, to be able to slow down and dial into that, and then give yourself that, like giving yourself permission to have needs and to meet those needs with kindness and love. That's really where the magic is at, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I'm curious about the comment.
So we have a wonderful comment. I would sneak food at night when I was younger. So this makes sense what you're saying.
Okay.
So really good.
So when I hear that comment, thank you so much. I mean, I immediately go to that child self, that was sneaking food at night and how alone, desperate, scared, just
confused.
Kind of confused, distressed inside. You must have been feeling, and then seeking food, and food works, and then, feeling comforted and then being able to sleep. So I think that, gosh, I don't know, if you can kind of connect to that part of yourself, just like we just did with this wonderful comment. Really through empathy and through compassion, remembering that self that you were when this was created and when there was no other means to be comforted or soothed. I bet you that would interrupt that blame cycle, because right in your heart, it gives you compassion.
Absolutely. It's like there's this precious little kid who's doing the best that she can to survive in a really tough situation. It's really, really hard when our environment isn't really responsive and attuned to us when we're little. That is what we need. We are incredibly needy and selfish when we're little. That's how it's supposed to be. And we need our environment to really match that and respond to that. And it's so hard when we're little and that's not happening.
And what we know is that when we have those deficiencies from our past, it's like that child part of ourself is never really able to grow up and mature because it hasn't gotten what it needs to progress. Okay. So even though you might be an adult that's 53 years old or 62 years old, when there is a deep or big emotion that occurs, that psychological younger part of yourself shows up in that same exact way.
Right.
Okay.
With those same needs.
The same needs,
Yeah.
the same tenderness, the same vulnerability, the same despair.
Yeah.
And that's what drives you once again to try to soothe through food.
That's right.
You know?
Yeah, I think when your younger self, or I sometimes will talk about like your little girl or your little boy, when she's activated or he's activated, her needs will always supersede your logic. It just will.
Yeah. Well, yeah, because I think that emotions, they do activate our system. And when our system is activated, we can't access our prefrontal cortex.
Nope.
I mean, like, it just is impossible.
Right.
So we have to calm ourselves down. Hopefully, we're learning how to do that, not with food, but with something that really meets our emotional needs, like hugs or understanding or compassion, exploring and responding to yourself. It calms down your system, and then you're able to kind of connect to that logic.
That's right. So your emotions and your logic live in different parts of the brain.
Yes.
So your logic lives right here, your emotions live back here. And the first place that shuts down when you get distressed is right here. So all logic goes out the window. And what is left then are these huge emotions. So we have to respond to those emotions first before we try distraction skills or changing our thought process or anything like that. You can try all day long. Sorry, guys, it's just not going to work. So you've got to get yourself, calmed, and not in an artificial way, but really responding to those emotions. And then this part of your brain comes back online, and then you can start to implement all of the great knowledge that you have.
Yeah. So when we talk about calming, if you rush in with that internalized critical voice, okay, what are you thinking about McDonald's again for?
Right.
Okay, or who thinks about chocolate, right? If you step in with that critical voice, I mean, listen to the harshness of my tone that I just said, all that does is it escalates the activation.
That's right.
Right? So you've got this vulnerability, you've got this need, right? You've got this internal distress, and then you come marching in with this critical self-judgment, okay? And then all it does, it gets more activated, right? And you want and need food more, right?
It makes a tough situation worse.
Absolutely. And then you go into these cycles, okay? So yes, if we can, really kind of connect to that part of yourself. If you can think back maybe to when you were little, when this process might have begun to get developed, okay? Connect to those tender parts of yourself. And when you find that you are thinking about food or reaching for food when you're not hungry, if you can connect to that emotion and connect that younger part of yourself to that emotion, and respond to that first, okay, with kindness and understanding and exploration of need and compassion, right? And then step in to meet that need in a real way.
Right.
I bet that compulsion, that desire for that food is gonna go away.
Yes.
Okay.
Absolutely. And it takes a lot of practice. Okay. So I want to normalize that.
Thank you.
You guys have heard this now. So it's not like you're going to go home and just start doing it perfectly. You've been practicing one way of thinking for a very long time. Okay. So this neurons that fire together, wire together, that's really ingrained. So it's going to take a lot of practice. When you feel something, you're naturally going to think about food, maybe even reach for food, and that's okay. What we want to do is just start to raise your awareness that you're doing that, and now you have another option. So if you feel yourself reaching into the pantry, you can say, oh, wait, let me practice something different. Let me slow down. Let me see if I can identify what I'm feeling. Even imagine yourself as that little girl, like you're saying, and really identify what might she be needing, and then see if you can just slow yourself down and maybe get one of those needs met.
Yeah. And if you're not able to do it immediately, please
okay.
don't rush in with that critical adult.
Right.
Okay? Maybe commend yourself for even trying.
Mhm.
Maybe commend yourself for even the awareness that, oh my gosh, I just emotionally ate. I had wanted to do this in a different way. I wasn't able to do it. Okay? At least that mindfulness and that awareness is a beginning step.
Yeah, and just like in my first recovery hacks, really normalizing the process of change. You don't learn something of this emotional nature and then just go implement it right away. I mean,
Right.
oftentimes you take in the information and then it just kind of has to percolate for a while. So it's totally normal if you continue to do some of the same behaviors and have some of the same thought processes, but this new information is slowly going to be integrating in. So be really patient with yourself. That's very, very important. Yeah.
So, how is this sounding? Is this hitting, a tender place within? Sometimes, if you're feeling anxiety, sometimes if you're feeling like, oh, I need to like turn this off and kind of do something else, it usually means that it's hitting a mark that you may or may not be ready to kind of experience. But I would tolerate whatever response you're having and just kind of try on some of this information.
Yeah.
Think back to your history, look at yourself in the here and now, kind of start exploring what some of your patterns are and practicing some of this compassion within yourself instead of blaming. I think that will go a long way.
Absolutely. And we will continue to connect the dots to really show you how and why all of this behavior makes sense, because it always does. It's not always obvious. Actually, rarely it's obvious, which is what makes this work the deeper work, because it's not obvious. It's kind of hiding in the shadows. But once you see it and understand it, it makes a lot of sense. And that in and of itself starts to decrease the shame, because when you can understand it, then you're not left with this default answer that, well, it's not working because there must be something wrong with me, right? Now we're offering you some new explanations for why you've done this, why you needed to do this, why you continue to do this, and then how you can change it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Beautiful.